Well, good evening, everybody. I'm speaking to you from the upper room here in the heart of Amsterdam. And this is the first of the Schuman talks that we're holding each month on the 9th day of the month, starting at 6 o'clock Central European time. And the reason why we do that, we want to draw attention to something that happened on the 9th of May, 1950, starting at 6 p.m., which I call the defining moment of post-European history. Because it was on that day that a fuse was lit that started a movement that has led to the European Union as it is today, a movement towards peace and unity, however imperfect it is. But on that particular day, a momentum was started that really has greatly shaped Europe over the last 70 years. And the person behind this was Robert Schuman, hence the name Schuman Talks. And each month on the 9th day, we're going to be taking something that Robert Schuman said from this little booklet called For Europe. It's the only book he ever wrote. It's got about 8 papers in it. And you can get your own copy for €5 from the Foundation Robert Schuman. That's not the same thing as the Schuman Center for European Studies. But you can look this up on the web, Foundation or Fondation Robert Schuman, and order the booklet. You see, in 3 minutes, which is as short as I'm going to be giving this intro, shorter than making a cup of coffee or boiling an egg, Robert Schuman laid the foundation for the European house in which today 500 million people live together in peace. The principles on which the declaration that he gave on that day, called the Schuman Declaration, came out of his own personal conviction and faith, a Christian faith. And this is something that's often overlooked. We're going to be exploring some of those themes over the next few months. But tonight, we have a very special guest with us who has been writing many books, many thick books, about Arabs, about Persians, about Greeks, about Romans. And I first came across him with this article from the New Statesman only 4 years ago, less than 4 years ago, why I was wrong about Christianity. So I want to introduce you tonight, Tom Holland. We're very pleased that Tom has come to join us. Very honored to have you, Tom, and look forward to our discussion together.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me.
Tell us, Tom, tell us a little bit just about yourself before we get into the book. Where are you right now? Who do you live with? Yeah, a little bit about yourself.
I'm in London, in an area of South London called Brixton, and I'm living with my wife and 2 daughters. So we've been enjoying a very familial lockdown together.
It's been a bizarre experience, hasn't it, for everybody?
It's been an incredibly odd experience, and I'm aware that I am incredibly lucky, because for me the lockdown has actually been fine. You know, I'm with people I love, I've got a garden, I've had lots of work to do, and the lockdown in London relative to places like Madrid has not too bad, actually. So what I've been chiefly doing to get my exercise is to go on enormously long walks across London, tracing the patterns of earlier calamities and earlier pandemics. So I've trodden in the footsteps of the narrator of War of the Worlds as he crosses from Putney to Primrose Hill, where he finds the Martians dead, wiped out by bacteria. I've gone in the footsteps of Chaucer, who of course wrote Canterbury Tales and The Shadow of the Black Death. I've walked in the footsteps of the horror film 28 Days Later, which is about a virus that escapes from a laboratory and turns everyone in Britain into flesh-eating zombies. So it's had its ups as well as its downs.
I can see there's lots of books coming out of this on your end.
Certainly lots of reflections. Yes, lots of
Yes,
reflections.
yes. Well, I can identify with the productivity that this lockdown has given to people who spend a lot of time writing. And now, that was quite a heading in New Statesman, why I was wrong about Christianity. What led you to write that article?
It was a realization that an awful lot of what I had been taking for granted about my own assumptions, my morals, and my values were wrong. I essentially, because I like to identify myself with the Greeks and the Romans, that is where I thought that essentially my morals and ethics derived from. And I furthermore assumed that they had essentially, a process of rebirth. There'd been a period of darkness when the Roman Empire fell. Then there'd been a kind of slow rising of the sun with the Renaissance, and then particularly, as the name implied, with the Enlightenment. But the experience of a lifetime writing about the Greeks and the Romans gradually brought home to me that this was essentially a myth, and that the chasm that separates us from pretty much everything the Romans took for granted is so profound that, in a sense, I think they are separated from us by a kind of insuperable division. And so I began to ask myself, well, what is this division? What caused it? And the more I thought about it, the more I came to realize that essentially what the great change is Christianity, and that Christianity, although bred of, nothing comes from nothing, it's bred of all kinds of elements within the world that it's born into: Persian dualism, Greek philosophy, Roman globalism, and of course, above all, the great heritage of Hebrew scripture and Jewish practice. But that all of these, in the globalized world of the Roman Empire, kind of merged and melted together to create something that was really radically new. And in a sense, the status of Christianity relative to classical antiquity is paradoxical, because Christianity is the most enduring and influential legacy of classical antiquity, but it's also the index of how utterly removed from classical antiquity we are.
Well, before you unpack that further, let me ask you, what did you know about Christianity? Did you have some kind of Christian background? I mean, you were fascinated by the classics. You talk in your book about as a child being fascinated by dinosaurs and so forth. What was it natural for you to be interested in Christianity?
I like things that were big and fierce and glamorous. So there's actually, the thing that prompts a small child to like tyrannosaurs and the Roman legions, it's pretty clear that there's something similar going on there. I was raised Christian. I went to church. I, unbelievably, considering how bad my voice is, I sung in the local choir, and my mother is a very devout Christian. So I was raised in that, and I enjoyed and found interesting the biblical stories. But the truth is that emotionally I was always on the side of the powerful. So I was always on the side of Pharaoh, of the Assyrians, of Nebuchadnezzar. And if you'd asked me to take sides between Pontius Pilate and Jesus, I would have completely been on the side of Pontius Pilate, because he had the eagles and the purple and all the mod cons, whereas Jesus was just a kind of scruff. No, so it wasn't that I ever had a kind of seismic, revulsion against Christianity, that I rejected it in a kind of Byronic way. It was just that I found it less interesting than the classical world.
When you say Byronic, you mean like Lord Byron and
yeah. Yeah, it's kind of shaking my fist at God and defying him to do his worst. I mean, I was never doing anything like that. It was kind of like a dimmer switch, just slowly fading out.
But when you wrote that article for the New Statesman, did you have in mind a book?
Yes, I thought I'd been wanting to write about it for quite some time, because And I veered between thinking that there was absolutely no need to write it at all because it was screamingly obvious, and then thinking, wow, this seems such a heretical stance to take, to argue that actually we're not shaped by the Enlightenment or the Renaissance at all, that we're essentially all Christian. And I found that when I talked to friends, particularly those who identified very strongly as secularists or humanists, that their tone of shock and disappointment was was such that I thought, well, actually, I've got to write this because clearly there are people who would disagree with the thesis quite profoundly, and that, of course, therefore makes it interesting. And aside from anything else, you know, I wanted to test it as well because, as I say, this was it seemed heretical to me, really. It kind of had the shock and the thrill of blasphemy for me, that I was in a way saying that the Enlightenment, which previously I'd identified with so strongly, and indeed the classical world, that both of them were kind of irrelevant compared to the impact on European culture that Christianity had had. That was, yeah, as I say, you know, had a kind of the force of blasphemy, and therefore I was excited to try and trace the contours of that.
Yeah, it sounds hugely heretical. Here's the big thick tome for those who've not laid their eyes on it. I'm intrigued, Tom, why you called it dominion, and could you say something about the making of the Western mind? That's the strapline on the British production. I think the American production has a different strapline. Is that right?
Yes, well, I think if you want to sum up the differences between America and Europe, the different straplines sum it up. My British editor wanted no mention of God or Christianity whatsoever on the cover because he thought that it would turn readers off. So that's why there's, if you look at that cover, there's almost no hint as to what the book is actually about. And the book is about the making of the Western mind, to the degree that it's about, you know, what it is that makes the West distinctive. Whereas the American title is How the Christian Revolution Changed the World, which is, I guess, a more specific and perhaps accurate description of what the book is about. I called it Dominion because there is it focuses on the central paradox of Christianity, which is that on the one hand, it enshrines the power of the powerless over the powerful, of the slaves over the masters, of the victims over the persecutors. And the symbol of that, of course, is the cross, which to the Romans was an emblem of their power, and under Christianity becomes an emblem of the way in which earthly power will pass away and the kingdom of heaven will be for all time. But there is that sense in which it enshrines the poor, the weak, and the suffering is counterpointed by the fact that the cross today is probably the most universally recognized cultural symbol that humanity has ever devised, and it's been planted in lands and continents undreamed of by the Romans. And so the dominion of Christianity is global, immense. It's endured for millennia, for centuries. And so there is an inherent tension, I think, between the claims of Christianity to speak for the downtrodden and the weak and the suffering, and the fact that it has this incredible ideological hegemony, which has no longer been confined to its birthplace in the Middle East, in Africa, in the Mediterranean, and then in the Western world, but has been spread often at the point of the sword around the world. And so it's that kind of tension between the understanding of dominion. Is it a spiritual dominion or is it a more earthly dominion?
Yeah. Let's just think a little bit more about this cross symbol. As you say, it is so prevalent and we take it so for granted. I look out the window right here. I'm downtown in Amsterdam. Look at the hotel across the road there. I see the Amsterdam flag. It has 3 St. Andrew's crosses. I look at the railway station here and I see shields of the cities with which Amsterdam traded. And many of them have crosses on. One has a monk and so forth. And yet we hardly ever pause to think, how did that cross, which was, as you point out in the book, such a terrible instrument of excruciating death, and the word comes from the whole process, excruciating, become a symbol of hope and healing, Red Cross, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, it's staggering. I mean, it's the most, it's really extraordinary. And I think that we in the West, as you say, have become desensitized to how odd it is. That the central symbol of our most powerful way of understanding the world is an instrument of torture. And to the Romans, it absolutely, it was a kind of emblem of their right to torture to death anyone who opposed them. And that was those who were rebels against Roman power, but more specifically, slaves who were in rebellion against their masters. So if you think of Spartacus, the Kirk Douglas film, famously, crosses end up being put all along the Appian Way. Those crosses are billboards advertising Roman power, because the reason that crucifixion was seen as the paradigmatic death for a slave wasn't just that it was agonizing, but that the humiliations suffered by people as they died were public. So if birds came and pecked out your eyes or attacked your genitals, there was nothing you could do about it. And this would be public, this would be exposed. And so in the early years of Christianity, everybody who is preaching this startling message that in some way the death of a slave on a cross has changed everything, that in a way God himself died on a cross, is seen by the people who are preaching this message as radically odd, let alone those who may be resistant to it. And so the earliest Christian source we have, which is the letters of Paul, Paul is endlessly going on about how this is, the Jews are going to see this as a stumbling block, to put it mildly, and everyone else, the Gentiles, the Greeks, the Romans, are going to basically see it as mad. And so they did. And the measure of that is that for centuries, and even after Constantine had become Christian, and Christianity had become the emblem of, had become the faith of the Roman Empire, and Constantine famously sees a vision of a cross before the battle that secures him possession of Rome. Even so, artists shrunk from portraying the crucifixion. It's only a century after Constantine that you start to get portraits of Christ on the cross, and even then he's portrayed as a kind of buff athlete, as an athlete who is won in the Olympics or in the games. And it's 1,000 years after Christ's birth until you see him portrayed dead on a cross. And then all the way through the Western Middle Ages, that's when, at a growing intensity, you start to get portrayals of Christ's sufferings in an ever more gruesome way. And I think because of we've been culturally, we've been through that process, we've come out the other side. And in a sense, people in the West now can look at a cross and they can blank out the awareness of what it actually represented and what it meant. If we want to get a sense of just how radically strange Christianity was in the context of the world in which it emerges, then we need to go back and think about what it actually was and what the sufferings of those who suffered on crosses actually involved.
Now that you mentioned about the depiction of Jesus on the cross about 1,000 years ago, so 1,000 years after Christ, is that the crucifixion hanging in Cologne Cathedral?
That's right, the Gero crucifix.
Yes, so on the left-hand side,
yeah,
towards the back of the church, or the cathedral.
Yes, just shortly before the first millennium, and I think not coincidentally, because I think one of the things that the first millennium did was to prompt all kinds of reflections in Christian Europe on the passage of time.
You mean as the year 1000 or 1033
yes.
came along?
Yeah.
Yes. Now, your realization that your values were much closer to Christian values than, say, the classics, was that a slow dawning, or have you had moments that you could call were epiphanies?
Well, the first book I wrote was about the fall of the Roman Republic. So that's the era of Julius Caesar, Cicero, Cleopatra, all the big names. And
what was the name of that book? That wasn't Dynasty.
So that book was called Rubicon, which is the river
Rubicon.
that Julius Caesar famously crosses, which brings the Republic crashing down into civil war. And when I was writing that, the backdrop was 9/11 and the build-up to the Iraq War, so the war on terror. And I felt that there was an obvious parallel between the Roman Republic, an imperial power, gate crashing its way into the Middle East, swinging its weight around, controlled by dynastic families, and the American Republic. And so this was something that I was kind of alluding to throughout the book. So there is actually a chapter called The War on Terror within it. But the more I wrote it, the more I kind of felt that actually America and Rome were incredibly different. And one of the things that really brought home to me was when the Iraq War began. And of course, there were massive protests all over the world about it. And the emphasis was very much on how this was a terrible thing to be doing. But what struck me was that the chasm of incomprehension that would have separated these anti-war marches from the Rome of Caesar, because Caesar, when he conquers Gaul, and everyone who's read Asterix, I think, is probably inclined to think that the conquest of Gaul happened without anybody dying at all. Possibly just a centurion or two hanging from a tree with stars going around his head, but nothing else much. Of course, that's not at all. It was a near genocidal campaign of conquest that according to Plutarch, writing a century or so afterwards, may be exaggerated, but not too much, I think, that 1 million Gauls died and 1 million Gauls were enslaved. And no one in Rome really had much of a problem with this at all. And in fact, Caesar boasted about it. And when he marched in triumph through the streets of Rome, placards would be carried boasting about, how much mayhem he'd inflicted. And Gallic leaders would be carried through in streets, in chains, being jeered at. Vercingetorix, the Gallic leader, hauled away and executed. All of this is grist to Caesar's mill. And this is an unconscionable difference to, American strategists nervously saying how few people they've killed. American generals emphasized how few the casualties are. Roman ones bigged up how vast they were. And that's a kind of very obvious contrast in terms of morality. But it was also in almost every aspect of Roman life where you might think that there were similarities, that there are constants, that there are unchanging fundamentals to human nature. And it turns out that aspects of Roman life that you might assume are actually very similar, they're not at all. And the obvious example of this is something as fundamental as attitudes towards sex. Roman attitudes to sex, and where this is a public broadcast, so I won't go into too much gory detail, but Roman attitudes to sex were incredibly different to ours. And this makes it very difficult for us when we read Roman love poetry or anything to do with Roman sexual relations, because we project assumptions about how sexuality should be comprehended, about how people should behave sexually onto Roman accounts. And so we get a very, very distorted sense of it. And again, when I was trying to work out, well, what actually is going on in these poems? What are the Romans talking about? What are, for instance, all these words that tend to get translated as homosexual? Did the Romans have a sense of something called homosexuality? No, they didn't at all. This is an incredibly recent category. And the more I tried to explore and to work out where these ideas of sexuality had come from that we have, the more the thread again led back to Christianity. So I just found myself again and again trying to follow the thread of things that I took for granted, that my friends took for granted, that the society in which I live takes for granted. The more I follow these threads back, the more it would lead not to Rome, not to Greece, but essentially to Golgotha, or at least, at the very least, let's say, to Paul's letters.
Yes, and of course, it's very true of the Greek attitude towards sex as well. And now, I'm intrigued by your use of the word Christendom all the way through. I would, in English, you have Christianity and Christendom. In Dutch, you only have the one word, and I find myself constantly having to express the difference between Christendom and Christianity. Now, there must be a reason why you're describing the whole of Christianity as Christendom, which in my understanding would be that alliance of the church and power, that place where the kings were Christians, shall we say. And I'm a seventh generation nonconformist, I guess, a bit allergic to the word Christendom.
Well, it's in its Latin form, the word that's translated into English as Christendom comes in at the end of the 11th century, as almost everything that makes the Middle Ages distinctive and convulsive in the West does. This is not coincidentally the era of the Crusades. It's looking forward to the emergence of the first universities. It's also looking forward to the first real concentrated attempt to persecute people who get defined as heretics. And all of these developments exist in the context of what I think has been described by historians much better than me as Europe's first revolution. And the reason it can legitimately be described as Europe's first revolution is that the very idea of revolution, the idea of that as something that is transformative and positive, is bred of distinctively Western Christendom. And it reflects a process that happens in the 11th century, whereby fairly fundamental Christian ideas about the individual, so the idea of baptism, the idea of repentance, the idea of the individual washing away his or her sins, comes to be applied to the entire body politic of those who would describe themselves as Christians. And the revolutionaries who push this program through do it by seizing control of the most significant office in Western Latin Christendom, which of course is the bishopric of Rome. The Pope has always been recognized as the most significant bishop in Latin Christendom. But what happens in the 11th century is that radicals use that office to force through an understanding of the church, which precipitates a really radical split within in the context of other Eurasian civilizations is kind of unparalleled, because what you get in medieval in Latin Christendom up until the 11th century, that you get in Byzantium, that you get in the Islamic world, that you get in Indian civilization, that you get in China, that you get in Japan, so right the way across Eurasia, is an assumption that if you are an earthly ruler, then you also have a stake in the supernatural dimension, and that more broadly, the idea that there are kind of separate categories of, well, let's call it, say, church and state, that these can be distinguished. There is no understanding of this at all.
Uh-huh.
And the idea that there are such things as church and state really beds down in the 11th century in Latin Christendom and becomes the distinguishing characteristic of what will become Western civilization, because it's rooted in Christian theological assumptions. The idea that there are twin dimensions, that there's a dimension called the cyculum, which is the dimension of earthly things, things that are born and live and die and pass away, and the dimension of the heavenly, of the celestial, which is eternal. And what offers humans who are born up on the cycle of the cyculum the chance to escape that churn, to escape mortality, to escape oblivion, is the religio, the bond that can join them to heaven. And it's the church that is the guardian of that religio, of that bond. And of course, the reformers in Rome claim that they uniquely, it's theirs to guard and to propagate. So over the course of the 11th century into the 12th, you see this incredibly radical sundering, whereby earthly rulers are told essentially to back off the church, that the church has to be sacral, it has to be pure, it has to be untainted, and that for earthly rulers to put their grubby, tainted hands on the radiant vestments of the church is akin to rape. And so this is why famously at Canossa, castle in the Apennines, you see the emperor the heir of Charlemagne and Constantine and Augustus kneel in the snow and beg for absolution from the Pope. And this is a process of radical separation that by the end of the 12th century sees enshrined the idea of there being two dimensions, the dimension of the saeculum, the dimension of what will come to be called religio. And you can see how this then sets up a division that over the course of the centuries that have followed comes to be ironically secularized, because what people in the 11th century called the saeculum comes in English to be called the secular, and what had been called religio comes to be called religion. And these are categories that Westerners, when they then started spreading out across the world, crossing the Atlantic to the New World, carving out colonies across Asia and Africa, moving to Australia and New Zealand, these are categories that they take. And so the fact that you have a Muslim country like Turkey, a Hindu country like India, defining themselves as secular republics, show that even they, to that extent, to that degree, have been Christianized, because they have internalized assumptions that derive from this convulsive process of revolution.
So
I'm aware that's a very long answer. And I
the irony is that the word secular is really, a religious word, and this.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, yeah. And I think that everyone who defines themselves as secular need to understand that it's not a neutral concept. It's not just something that exists. It's something that is rooted in the seedbed of Christian history and Christian theology. To be secular, in a sense, is to be Christianized.
Yeah. Recently, somebody sent me an article about atheists championing Christianity, and your name was mentioned in that. Douglas Murray's name was mentioned in that, and I believe, for those who don't know the name of Douglas Murray, he's written a number of books about the strange death of Europe, for example. He calls himself a Christian atheist, which might sound like an impossibility, frozen steam. Even Richard Dawkins, a radical evangelistic atheist, seems to be beginning to realize that if Christianity goes, the result may not be what he would like. How would you describe yourself in terms of, do you feel comfortable with it? Are you in the sense of, like somebody has said, a King Agrippa, almost thou persuadest me, but I can't quite believe? Where are you in that spectrum?
Well, let me answer that by talking about not about Christian atheists, but about anti-Christian atheists, because I think that in a sense they are as Christian as anyone in the context of the current world. I think that there is a sense in which anti-Christian atheism is a logical endpoint for trends within that have always been there within Christianity. So if you go back to this 11th century revolution, this convulsion, it's founded on the idea that idols should be overthrown, that superstition should be banished, that people who'd been in darkness should be brought into light. And these, of course, are ideas that are found in Scripture, in the New Testament, in the Hebrew prophets. And it sets up this idea that the world can be reformed. The Latin word reformatio means, remaking it, reconfiguring it, purging it of folly, purging it of superstition. Now, what happens over the course of the Middle Ages is that there are lots of Christians who feel that this process has not gone far enough, and that the revolutionaries of the 11th century have become, if you like, guardians of superstition. And in the 16th century, sure enough, this precipitates another bout of reformatio, what we call in English the Reformation. And the Reformation likewise enshrines this idea that idols should be toppled, that superstition should be banished, that people should be brought into light. Only now the idols that are toppled are those of the Catholic Church. The superstition that has to be banished is the popery of the rebels. So the cycle churns. What's happened in particularly in Protestant countries is that Protestantism itself is now the subject of these convulsions. Christianity itself has been enshrined as the superstition that has to be banished, the idols that have to be toppled. And so, in a sense, the deep seriousness with which someone like Richard Dawkins argues for the urgent need that Christianity and other superstitions be banished is absolutely the marker of how culturally Christian he is. So in that sense, I think that he's a far more committed, passionate, convinced proponent of Protestantism than many Protestant leaders today. And it's that kind of realization that actually to be an atheist is simply to be a variant of Christian that kind of served as a gear shift for me. Because to be honest, if atheism itself is just a form of belief, if it requires the same kind of leap of faith that Christianity does, it's a pretty boring form of Christianity. I think it's a kind of attenuated, dull form. And the truth is that if there are things that I want to believe in, the conviction that all human beings are created equal, the idea that love percolates the world, the idea that that there should be no black or white, no difference between men or women, no difference between slave or free. And again, if I want to think, well, where do these ideas come from? Ultimately, I have to go back to Christianity, and if I'm going to believe them, that is a kind of leap of faith. So where I am at the moment is that these are things that I believe in. I do believe in them. I believe in human rights. I believe in those kind of ideas, but they have no objective reality. I mean, so, to believe in human rights, you have to take a leap of faith. So in a sense, is it that much greater a leap of faith to believe the essence of the truth of Christianity? The problem for me remains that I can't quite believe it, but I would very much like to believe it. So I would say that I'm certainly not an atheist. I would say that I'm an agnostic with a yearning to believe that I'm standing on the diving board waiting to take that jump. But because I'm a coward, I'm not not quite ready to make that jump yet. But I very much like to believe.
Push you in.
Yeah.
No, you use the term Christian, meaning acceptance of a framework of understanding, not necessarily in the way that evangelicals of my background would use it in terms of committed Christian. What often in America.
I suppose I use it in the sense that we might talk of the Islamic world without necessarily meaning that everybody in it is necessarily a Muslim. I think that pretty much everything that makes the West distinctive derives from Christian assumptions and is expressive of Christian assumptions. So you don't need to believe that the Lord Jesus Christ rose on the third day and ascended to heaven to take for granted such categories as the secular or homosexuality and heterosexuality, things like that. And in that sense, if you take for granted these assumptions, then you are, culturally speaking, Christian.
Now, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the source of some of the things you're just talking about. I first met you here in Amsterdam. It was just before lockdown, right in the beginning of March, and you were speaking at the De Bali Debate Center here. And as my wife and I walked into this very secular place, here was projected on the wall a verse from the Bible. And an actress began to read out that verse. Now, Cedric, you're behind the scenes there. If you could put that slide up there, that you began to quote from this, Galatians 3:28. Would you comment on this? Why was this? I've heard you call it revolutionary.
Well, I've already kind of in a slightly garbled way, quoted it during our talk tonight. In one way, it's not revolutionary, because it is fed by two streams. One of those, obviously, is biblical. Paul, as a Jew, is completely familiar with the beginnings of Genesis, in which all human beings, male and female, are created in the image of God, and so that gives everybody who's created, every human being, an incredible degree of dignity, a degree of dignity that no other mythological framework in the ancient world provides. What you also get in that is a kind of echo of a Greek philosophy called Stoicism, and the Stoics believe that everything in the universe is divine, and therefore every human being has a spark of the divine, and they call this synodesis, which Paul uses to describe what essentially is conscience, the idea that there is a kind of the idea of the law of God is imprinted on every human heart. And if that's the case, then that means that there is a kind of radical equality, that Paul sees Christ's death on the cross as revealing to the world, that this relationship that God, this relationship of love that God had given to the children of Israel, is now available to everyone. And to that extent, there is no Greek or Jew. Differences of ethnicity and culture are completely dissolved. And so too, very radically, are differences of gender. Male and female, there is no male or female in Christ. There is no slave or free in Christ. And so there's a potential there, kind of incredibly radical egalitarianism. Now, of course, there is at the end of that sentence, in Christ. So Paul himself elsewhere completely affirms that there are differences between men and women, and he does not at any point argue for the abolition of slavery as an institution. But if you think of Paul's letters as being full of depth charges, which have been planted under the surface and which keep exploding at periodic intervals, sending ricochets out, destroying the fabric of the cities and the structures and the assumptions that have been built above them, then you get a sense of what's going on with this sentence. Because what has happened over the course of the 2,000 years since he wrote it is that people have come to slightly park that in Christ bit and have come to argue instead that there are no differences between there should be no differences between people based on their race. There should be no differences between men and women. There should be no differences between slave and free, and indeed there should be no slavery. And of course, all of these, right up into the present, retain their ability to generate enormous upheavals. It generates its potential to get people marching through the streets in a time of pandemic. It generates the ability of people to topple statues. All of these are still ongoing. And if you want to say, well, okay, where are these ripples coming from? This is basically where it comes from.
Yeah. Well, before we close in a little while, I want to come back to what's going on in the world right now in terms of the Black Lives Matters and so forth. But we do want to bring this gentleman into the picture as well. But I have a short question, a two-word question, before we close off this section as you're talking about your book. So what? You've laid bare the Christian nature, really, of our society, and I've heard you say if we are the fish in a goldfish bowl, everything we're swimming in is Christianity. But so what? Okay, that's our roots. Does that make any difference for how we should live today or tomorrow?
Well, this is the big question that I think the West faces, and I think it's part of what's making the events in the present so convulsive and so contested, because essentially I think we face in the West three possibilities. One is that we don't need Christianity for Christian values to continue to self-perpetuate, to self-sustain. That, if you like, confessional Christianity is the kind of the rocket that has blasted us through the atmosphere, and now humanism, secularism, liberalism, whatever you want to call it, can disengage from the rocket boosters of Christianity and can proceed through time and space under its own velocity. And that may well be the case, in which case the relationship of secularism, humanism, liberalism to Christianity is indeed just a historical curiosity. We don't need Christianity for these values to be perpetuated. The other option, the other alternative, however, is slightly darker, and it's been prefigured famously by Nietzsche, and then in the wake of Nietzsche in a very bastardized form by the Nazis, which is that if Christianity is untrue, then we don't need its morals, we don't need its ethics, and we can return to the kind of morality that existed in the classical world, in which the primacy over the strong over the weak was absolutely enshrined, which of course the Nazis used to justify euthanasia of those who were who they felt had no right to life. And the other thing, of course, notoriously, that the Nazis did by rejecting Christianity was to reject the Pauline understanding that there is no Jew or Greek, and to say absolutely there are Jews and Greeks, and the Jews have destroyed the racial purity of the Greeks, and therefore we must destroy the Jews. Now, there's an incredibly brutal irony to this, because of course, one of the shadows of Paul's idea that there is no Jew or Greek is, what do you do with people who don't want to have their distinctiveness dissolved, of whom the Jews are the paradigmatic example? And so the hostility of Christian universalism to Jewish exceptionalism over the 2,000 years is the great blot on Christian history. And the Nazis completely weaponized that. But the paradox is that the Nazis wanted to destroy the Jews because they blamed the Jews for Christianity, which just kind of sharpens the cruelty and the horror of what happened. So for 70 years, the horror of that has served as an inoculation. But it may be that the kind of the power of people saying you're a Nazi or you're Hitler to people is fading, and that therefore the future may be one in which ethno-chauvinism, a rejection of the obligation of the strong to the weak, does come to put very deep roots down. So that may be another alternative. And the third alternative is that if we, the intellectual, the theological justifications for liberalism may come to seem so attenuated that people start to look and say, well, how are we going to justify them? And they may look back to Christianity and find that essentially, as Nietzsche said, you can't have Christian values and Christian ethics in the long run without Christian belief. So the third option is perhaps that the West will return to a sense of of Christian faith. Now, I'm not a prophet, so I don't know which of those three alternatives, which of those three roads we as Europeans will end up taking. But I think we're going to be taking one of those three routes.
Well, Tom, do you think there's a chance that just as 1989 was seen as the death knell of communism, 2020 will be looked back on as the time where neoliberalism became discredited, and that right now we're being faced very much with a choice? Are we seeing these booster rockets or rockets disintegrating? I suppose.
Well, no, I don't. I mean, I think that in a way, liberalism is going through its Reformation stage at the moment, because I mean, it's literally destroying statues and idols and toppling them in the name of liberalism, proclaiming messages of radical egalitarianism, purging darkness, bringing people into light. it's a deeply religious movement, and it's deeply founded in the seedbed of Christianity. But the difference between this and, say, the civil rights movement in America in the 50s and 60s is that Martin Luther King was very overtly Christian. He understood that the stories that he was telling to justify to white Americans why white Americans should accept black people as their brothers and sisters was rooted in the shared faith, the shared understanding of the biblical stories. So whether it was the story of Exodus, of the slaves being freed and being brought to a promised land, or whether it was the fundamental Christian idea of kind of commonality, as we've been talking about, of there being, there's no Jew or Greek, and there's no black or white. These were rooted in the shared inheritance that black and white Americans had. That common language seems gone now. No one is talking about Black Lives Matter is not drawing overtly on that Christian inheritance to empower itself.
I want to go. You talk several times about Martin Luther King in your book, but let's keep that for our closing question. Let's go now to our friend Robert Schuman, and I'd like to ask you to respond to several what would be called also heretical statements in today's world about democracy. Now, as you've studied the classics, you've studied all the medieval times, etc., and the development of Western civilization, Schuman said democracy owes its existence to Christianity. Now, that would come as quite a shock to a lot of people. He also said democracy is essentially evangelic. And this is a translation from the French, and I think it means is drawn actually from the gospel, since love is its mainspring. Perhaps we can show that on the screen as well. Democracy is essentially evangelic, since love is its mainspring. Then he goes on to say something even more radical. Democracy will be Christian or it will not be. An anti-Christian democracy would be a parody, which would sink into tyranny or into anarchy. Now, I would be very intrigued to know what your response is to these fairly heretical statements being made by this devout Catholic.
Well, I think he's slightly over-egging it, to be honest. I mean, clearly, democracy comes from the Greek. And specifically, it comes from I think we can call it a revolution, transformation, the great civic convulsion that saw Athens at the end of the 6th century BC become a state in which power, kratia, was given to the people, the demos. And Athens was absolutely a democracy. That's how it described itself. I mean, I didn't see how else you could possibly describe. Well, for effectively for 160 years, 170 years with gaps. But it was by our standards, by the standards of representative democracies, it was vastly more democratic. Now, of course, as everyone says now, it was democratic if you were a male citizen. It wasn't democratic if you were a woman, and it wasn't democratic if you were a metic, a kind of resident alien, or if you were a slave. The reason why that's become a problem for people today, I think, is rooted in Christianity. People in Athens, radically democratic though they were, those who held citizenship did not, for a minute, think that women or slaves should share in the democracy, because they saw both women and slaves as being naturally inferior to the free male citizen.
Which is a recent idea.
The idea that that everyone should have a stake, I think, does derive from Christian principles. But again, I think it would be a profound mistake to see this as this explicitly political program as being fundamental to what Christianity historically has taught and assumed. So I'll give you an example. There is a famous account of a martyrdom that took place in Lyon at the end of the 2nd century. And many of the martyrdom accounts are implausible, unreliable. This is one that is generally thought to be pretty reliable. And it describes a large number of people from Lyon who suffer death for their Christian beliefs. And among them is are high-class males, citizens, and there is a female who is high class, but we're not told her name. She dies, she's a martyr, but we don't know who she is. The person who is picked out is the slave of this high-class woman, and we get told her name. She's called Blandina, and she is described in her final torments as being like Christ. She looks like Christ. So in this account, it is the person who is doubly inferior as a woman and as a slave who is compared to Christ, who is the heavenly king. And the assumption is that Blandina, when she dies, goes straight to the great palace of the Almighty. And this is at a time when most Christians assume that if you die, you're held in a kind of atrium, in a pending state, waiting for the day of judgment. And this corresponds to how in the Roman world, clients would not immediately be admitted into the depths of a Roman household, of a Roman patron's household. But Blandina, the slave girl, is, and she will sit at the right hand of Christ right from the beginning. She has won this incredible status. So in that sense, heaven is imagined in our terms as being deeply democratic. It doesn't matter what your background is, where you come from. If you have earned the right to be with God, then you get it. And it doesn't matter whether you're a woman, whether you're a slave, what you are. Now, does that translate to an understanding in the Christian world that God's kingdom should be replicated on earth? No, because the whole point is that Christ's kingdom is not of this earth. And so that in itself is what opens up the opportunity for Latin Christendom to go on this distinctive path, this idea that actually the dimensions of what comes to be called religion and the secular can be viewed as separate. And it's that has enabled Christianity over the course of its 2,000-year history to breed an unbelievable variety of political responses to what kind of government should people live under. So of course it absolutely, Christian values have informed a very radical kind of democracy. That's absolutely clear. But it has also sustained theocratic frameworks of government. It has sustained imperial frameworks of government. The Reformation in particular was an absolute kind of foundry for different people devising different ways of governing themselves. And a lot of the kind of political differences that distinguish European countries to this day are bred of that period. So I think that to the degree that the founding idea, I suppose the animating idea of European democracy today is that everyone has a vote by right. That is something that does derive from ultimately Christian assumptions. But I don't think that it is that democracy is necessarily a part of what it is to be Christian. I think historically it's been perfectly possible to be a Christian and not be a Democrat.
Yes, just let me ask you this. Is there a direct line between Athens and any European capital in terms of the actual development of democracy? It would seem that, if we look at parliamentary democracy, we see the role that Geneva played there, for example, even in the influencing of Rousseau and Voltaire. The idea of moral equality, of each person having dignity, being created in the image of God, and the concept of agape, love, and you have a whole chapter in your book about this radical concept. It would seem that these have been fairly essential elements in actually shaping the form of democracy without the Bible itself presenting a blueprint for any particular form of governmental structure.
Well, I think there've been two ways in which the classical inheritance, the classical understanding, if not of democracy, then the Roman one of a res publica, a republic, has kind of bled into modern. I use modern in the kind of, since the 14th century of Europe and America. And the first is the Renaissance, and the most problematic, the most challenging figure in that is Machiavelli. And Machiavelli's whole point is that actually Christianity is a terrible basis for running a government, because if everyone's turning the other cheek and putting up their sword, how is a prince to survive? And this is a kind of the reason that Machiavelli becomes a byword for depravity, is that an enormous number of people in 16th century, 17th century Europe kind of recognize that there's an element of truth to this, and that perhaps this is, it's all very well, Christ's kingdom being not of this earth. What might the implications of that be if you're an earthly governor? Perhaps you actually do need to look to Greece and Rome to get some lessons, to get some advice on how to run a government. So that's why Hobbes, who lived in the aftermath of the civil wars that had convulsed Britain, said that, he said, I would ban the study of the Greeks and the Romans because they're highly seditious. They undermine the fabric of order. Then again, what happens in the late 18th century, first with the American Revolution, and then even more seismically with the French Revolution, is that I think that the French Revolution is absolutely bred of Christian assumptions. It's, the idea that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Where is this coming from? It's not coming from anywhere other than basically the teachings of Jesus. And when the revolutionaries attack the church, they're doing it for fundamentally Christian reasons. The church has become associated with the powerful, with the hierarchy. That's why it has to be pulled down. Christ was a sans culotte. Give away your earthly possessions. Share your clothes with the naked beggar. The parable of the rich man and Lazarus entirely underpinned. It's the kind of the molten heart of the French Revolution. But the French revolutionaries, when they want to look back for their foundations, they don't want to look to the church because they've overthrown it. They've introduced their own year zero. So they look back to Rome. David is always, he's painting the French revolutionaries very much as though they look like ancient Romans. Yeah. But also, they for the first time, they look back to classical Athens and to the democracy. And the democracy over the course of European history, and even in the time of ancient Athens, is viewed as a monstrous aberration. Even in ancient Athens, the Athenian sources that we have for it all condemn it. Thucydides, Plato, they all have massive, massive issues with it. And right the way through up to the French Revolution, basically, Athens stands as a kind of warning of what happens when you let people run things. It turns, becomes a disaster. They all do terrible things. With the French Revolution and its aftermath, you start to get people saying, actually, this provides us with a model. And so in that sense, I think that 19th and 20th century democratic ideals, I don't think it's fair to say that this owes nothing to Greece. I think it does. I think it is essentially Greece, the model of ancient Athens, provides people who want to enshrine Christian ideals of shared egalitarianism with an ancestry that is not Christian. And because this ancestry is believed, becomes institutionalized, therefore it becomes a real ancestry. It's a kind of graft, if you like. And in that sense, I think it's entirely reasonable for modern Europe to trace its origins back to ancient Athens. But I think, as notoriously in the preamble to the Lisbon Treaty that ended up being rejected, this was overtly stated that Europe has its roots in the polities of Athens, of Rome. But of course, what it notoriously neglected to say was that it also had its roots in Christianity, because that would be too problematic, too difficult. But I think it's ridiculous. I mean, you can't possibly have talk about European democracy as deriving only from Athens. It doesn't. It absolutely derives from Christian assumptions as well.
Yeah, I think we could continue having a long discussion about this, talking about what was the role of Moses and Jethro and the election of elders there, that then was picked up later by Calvin, and the election of elders for the church there, and what was good for the church was good for the state, and that model being picked up by England and Scotland and Holland and the Pilgrim Fathers, etc. But of course, the Christian understanding was not just the idealistic side, it was also the realistic side concerning the fallen nature of man. And out of that came the checks and balances that we see then being brought into the American structures. So this is an intriguing whole area, but I think your whole work is such a stimulus to challenge many people in the understanding that they have had concerning, well, what is the basis of our Western civilization? What values are we going to choose for in the future? But I'd like to go back to Martin Luther King as our closing subject. And you write about him in several places in your book, and you're the same chapter as the chapter of the Beatles and John Lennon talking about all you need is love. And of course, this was the basis of Martin Luther King's message: only love can drive out hatred. This is actually a poster we used during our State of Europe forum 3 years ago in Malta. We actually had a march through the streets with several similar banners. But then right now, what's going on, there's been a lot of comparison with the civil rights movement of the 60s. Do you see differences and parallels where this message of love had a spokesperson in terms of Martin Luther King? What role is love playing in the current protests?
I think that one of the reasons why the protests have taken the form they have in America, and why they've had a particular resonance in Britain and indeed in the Netherlands, is because America, Britain, and the Netherlands in the 16th, 17th century were part of a single Protestant Atlantic civilization, and we are all in our respective countries shaped by the influence of that. And the reason that slavery is such a lightning rod still and has the capacity to bring people out on the streets and topple statues is because it was Protestants in this emerging Atlantic civilization that kind of pushed the institution of slavery that people had always taken for granted, that Christians regarded as a terrible curse, but rather in the way that they would regard illness as just being part of the way life was. Dutch and English slave traders pushed what had always been an accepted institution to terrifyingly kind of almost proto-industrial extremes. And it's a little bit like the difference between eating an organic chicken and eating a chicken that's being bred for Kentucky Fried Chicken. In the end, the spectacle of mass slavery as institutionalized in the plantations in the Caribbean and in the English North American colonies revolted people, the slave owners themselves, the white people who were in charge, to a degree where they started to question the very institution of slavery. And this was further sharpened for them by the fact that slavery had become racialized. To begin with, in the plantations, the slaves were as likely to be white as they were black. By the 18th century, that was no longer the case. And if you think that there's no Jew or Greek, therefore there is no man or woman, that all human beings are created with an equal dignity, it puts quite a strain on the conscience to justify that degree of racialized slavery. And so over the course of the 18th century, particularly in the English-speaking world, the distinctive form that first of all Quakers and then evangelicals take in their attitude towards scripture, which is that it's not the bare word on the page that matters, it's how the Spirit descends and animates your understanding of that. All of these elements fuse to convince large numbers of people on both sides of the Atlantic that the institution of slavery is wrong. And by the beginning of the 19th century, this has lit a kind of Pentecostal fire that comes to blaze and burn, first of all, through the British Empire, then, of course, through America, resulting in the Civil War. And the Civil War still, you know, it gets rid of slavery, but it doesn't give to American Black people the dignity that white people take for granted. And so in the 50s and the 60s, this generates yet another great Pentecostal blaze, the great blaze of summoning by Black Christians to white Christians in America to be true to their own ideals. And Martin Luther King, of course, is the great spokesman for this. And he says that he is an extremist, but as Jesus was, he's an extremist for love. And what King can do is that although he is beaten up, although he is arrested, although he ends up being shot, his message is one that, because it is grounded in assumptions that white American Christians accept as well, does come to be broadly accepted by a growing number of people in America. But essentially what's happened since the 60s is that this message has been separated from the kind of specifically Christian theological seedbed that had nurtured it. So what you see with Black Lives Matter is that, as we talked about before, is that actually it turns out you don't need the Christian stories and the Christian theology to animate these assumptions. And the question really is whether without the Christian narratives, without the Christian theological assumptions that had bred them, do they take a different course? Yeah. And I guess that that one element that is missing is that actually the notion of original sin that so many liberals find objectionable. But that is quite a democratic ideal, because it reminds us that we're all equal, basically, that we're all prone to doing terrible things. The temptation without the doctrine of original sin is that you end up thinking that you can become virtuous by your own agency, the Pelagian heresy. And I think there's a case for saying that there is a deep strain of Pelagianism at the moment in liberalism that potentially risks hubris.
Well, coming back to the so what question, we're being faced with that right now. I think that we see the mixture of, I would say there are definite anarchistic elements, and yet on the other hand, the response, the resonance that it has brought, well, we're tempted to say globally, but really it's been in countries with a Christian background that are responding right now.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's exclusively concerning slavery backgrounds. If you look at the Pew Research records concerning attitudes towards other ethnicities of Europe, we are much more prejudicial than in America even. And that's quite surprising to discover that, and it has to do with the attitude towards migrants and so forth. But we are in a very crucial time, being put to the test with this corona crisis as well, as to how, on what basis are we going to make decisions concerning what kind of world, what kind of Europe, what kind of nation, what kind of society we want to be. And so I think you've done us all a huge favor, Tom, in taking us through the centuries in your book, and also a huge favor today in all that you've been sharing with us. I'm sure this is a video many people will go back over to chew on what you've been telling us. And I want to say thank you very much on behalf of all of those who have been following and will be following this discussion. This has been extremely constructive for us. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you very much for asking me. Very honored.
Okay, well then, next month we will continue on the 9th day of July in this case, and we've invited Dr. Jonathan Chaplin from Cambridge to talk about Britain and Europe. Is there a way forward? And again, Robert Schuman has a whole chapter in this little book where he talks about the difficulty he sees. He calls it England, but he means Britain will always have concerning relating to Europe. He quotes here, "It seemed impossible to a," quote has just disappeared, "to a Britain that there might be an authority superior to that of the British Parliament." So we're hoping Jonathan will be able to be with us. He addressed us in 2016 at the State of Europe Forum here in Amsterdam, right before the Brexit referendum. And so I think he's been tracking this very closely. And it's a question that's challenging us all concerning the relationship between Britain and, I will say, the rest of Europe, not Europe, because Britain cannot escape Europe. And this is still a very, very crucial question for us all to answer or to wrestle with. So with this, we'll close off. And thank you very much for joining us on this, our first Schuman Talk. And we look forward to seeing you on the 9th day of each month at 6 p.m. All the very best.